Welcome to today's discussion on the Federalist and Anti-Federalist Papers, sponsored by the Principles of Freedom Foundation. The purpose of this foundation is to provide a platform for discussing the ideas pertaining to freedom, just as was done in town squares, churches, and taverns during the founding era of this nation. Ideally, those who listen to or participate in this discussion will have come prepared by having read the material to be discussed today. Participants in today's discussion are Brooklyn McClure, Derek Harris, Julia Farnbach, Tiffany Mason, David Bishop, Leah Hone, and myself, Tyler Mason. We hope you will continue to participate in the discussion of freedom, even beyond this podcast, by coming on our Facebook group, YouTube channel, and most importantly, having dialogue with your own family and neighbors. We're going to turn the time over to Brooke to begin our discussion today as we dive into our topic.
Thank you, Tyler, for that intro. So today's readings had a lot to do with standing armies. And so I wanted to open our discussion with that topic. I found it interesting that the Federalist and Anti-Federalist seem to agree on a lot of points with regard to the standing armies, in that they're dangerous. But it seemed like the Anti-Federalists, or at least Brutus, felt that there wasn't enough done to protect against the tyranny that can come about if you give that, if you give the standing armies too much power, especially with the executive, who could become like a king. And so I wanted to open by, I thought his suggestion actually of how to amend the Constitution and make it more specific was interesting. So I just wanted to get your thoughts maybe on this as I read it, or on any other thoughts you had on the topic of standing armies, because we have a lot of it today, a standing army in a time of peace. I think we do, but maybe we don't. So I want to get your opinion on that, because I think it could be argued that, are we really in a time of peace right now? And, you know, what thoughts you had. So Brutus says he would be happy if this clause were included in the Constitution. As standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty and have often been the means of overturning the best constitutions of government, no standing army or troops of any description whatsoever shall be raised or kept up by the legislature, except so many as shall be necessary for guards to the arsenals of the United States, or for garrisons to such posts on the frontiers as it shall be deemed absolutely necessary to hold, to secure the inhabitants and facilitate the trade with the Indians. Unless when the United States are threatened with an attack or invasion from some foreign power, in which case the legislature shall be authorized to raise an army to be prepared to repel the attack, provided that no troops whatsoever shall be raised in time of peace without the assent of 2/3 of the members composing both houses of the legislature. So that's a lot more detailed than what is in our Constitution in Article 1, Section 8 of the powers of Congress. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think the initial point you mentioned, Brooke, are we at a time of peace? I think is pertinent, because how do you determine what would constitute a time of peace, right? Is a time of peace just simply when a country, the United States, for example, is not actively at war with somebody else? Is that a time of peace? Or is a time of peace bigger than that, especially in the world we live in now? I mean, for Britain to be able to send troops to come and invade us in colonial time wasn't just something that happened, but now you can fire an intercontinental ballistic missile in a matter of hours. You can devastate a country, right? So I think that that's something that needs to be considered, is what constitutes a time of peace.
And its corollary, what constitutes war? Because we've We've had wars that were undeclared in the last 60 years, right? 70 years. The last 70 years, we've had a lot of what we would call war, a lot of warfare, a lot of people dying, trillions of dollars spent for things that weren't declared a war. And most of the wars that we were in that were declared, we declared those because we were drawn in to defend ourselves. There's only one or two of the wars we have declared that I think anybody could say we initiated or stoked the fire, I guess. So yeah, we need to know, and I think that's where the loophole exists between the president having the position as commander-in-chief and needing to have an energetic single entity have the power to respond to a crisis while keeping the slower, more thoughtful Congress with the responsibility to declare that war, and which has to come first. And we've seen in history, modern and a couple hundred years old, sometimes it's a chicken and sometimes it's an egg, and I don't know that there's a lot of clarity about it in statute, or in practice.
Well, I think there's almost two separate discussions here that go along with this. One would be the constitutionality of what we are facing right now in terms of our military. And then the other is it or is it not necessary to have it the way it is? And so I think like what Tyler was alluding to is kind of the way I look at it is I kind of feel like the way it's set up is more or less the way it has to be in our time. And it's something that the founding fathers couldn't have foreseen. They had no idea the accessibility that would be available between nations in our day. There's no way they could have imagined, in a time when it would take, however long it would to get an army together and across the ocean and, organized in that way, versus today when, like he said, it can be hours and mass devastation taking place. So that's one issue, like the necessity of how it is. But still, whether or not that is constitutional or that's something that needs to be changed, I think is kind of the separate issue.
And I think it's important also to point out, Juliet, with your comment, we don't even necessarily have to have standing armies that invade. I mean, let's consider what can constitute warfare. It used to be warfare was mostly militarily, could be somewhat political, but that usually intermixed in military, or it could be economic. But that was really, war was simple back then from a definitive standpoint. Now we have cyber warfare, we have economic warfare, we have biological warfare, we have, like the list has just gone really, really big. And with a lot of these types of warfare, you can have an 18-year-old, a 16-year-old in a basement somewhere waging war with another country. You turn off their electrical power, you turn off their water systems, you turn off their information. I mean, you see people now that it was not too long ago. One of the big things that you are seeing a lot of companies protecting themselves against is data breach. And there's a couple of hospitals that all of their records were held absolutely hostage by like 3 people, right? That could be considered an act of war if it's done with the right leverage. And all of a sudden, so when we look at a standing army, I think now it's not even just as simple as, well, we've got people with guns. We've got people with guns and people with computers and people with medical degrees and people with, all of these different things that need to go into creating a standing army because there are so many threats.
I'm wondering where, like, the thing that comes to my mind is the fact that we are all over the world, that we have bases all over the world. And like, what would the founding fathers think of that? You know, like, I wonder where that falls into like the vision that they had of like a standing army. That completely changes. Like you said, there's so many different aspects now to warfare, but also the fact that, like, how does that fit into like our Constitution, for us to have bases and a standing army in different areas of the world, which you could argue became more necessary between World War I and World War II. Like, you know, we realized that we couldn't just, you know, stay on our own shores, but like, I don't know, like, I think it just completely, like, the whole dynamic of warfare and a standing army is completely different. I can't imagine that the founding fathers would have even been able to comprehend or even fathom. I mean, that what we face now, I mean, they should have been able to foresee, I mean, given like the Roman Empire, you know, and seeing the expansion of the Roman Empire and the British Empire, which was in their time, see that expansion, see like that colonialism, which they fought against. But a lot of people would argue that America is guilty of colonialism, even if we aren't actually colonizing different places. We do have a military presence all over the world, and it's very controversial in a lot of countries. People feel like that's not right. But is it constitutional? Is it right? Is it necessary? I don't know.
That's so interesting. I think we know what President Washington would have thought of that, as he said not to make these alliances with other countries.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
those are some
He
thoughts
was more of an
I had thought of.
isolationist.
Yeah, with Tyler, with regard to the different types of warfare. And then Leah and I had been talking earlier in our Kid Liberty class too about what constitutes an act of war. So you have the president who has power to be commander-in-chief after war has been legally declared by both houses of Congress. But since World War II, we haven't ever had a war legally declared that way. So now we're in, you know, in these different countries, and what if our president just perpetually a commander-in-chief for the whole world? You know, it's like, well, we have an army in Japan and we have them in Germany, and oh well, now this person's offended us, let's bomb Iraq. Is that constitutional when there's never been an actual declaration of war? So those are.
And that's exactly why it has devolved into a point where the president, based on his military advisors, will go and take preemptive action or retaliatory action, and then they wait and see if that's enough. And if it's not, it has to continue. Then they go to Congress to get approval for what they've already done. And so that's that chicken and egg thing. And I don't think that, like Juliet said, I don't think the founding fathers, I didn't expect them to, see the future. They were doing what they had to do to protect their posterity. But when in that quote that you brought up, from Brutus, Brooke, in the last lines, he talks about legislature then authorizing an army to get prepared to repel the attack. And the word that jumped out at me was prepared. And, you know, the Americans had just done the impossible, beat the best military in the world with their ragtag militia of farmers and gentlemen who grabbed their guns and ran. Right. And so they're thinking, or Brutus is thinking, that we don't need to have a standing army. We don't want to have a standing army because idle hands are the devil's plaything. But he doesn't envision having anybody trained and ready to go. He's talking about if and when a problem happens, we will gather the legislature from their 800 miles away wherever they are in the colonies, and then we will decide what to do, and then we will gather our men and train them, and that just doesn't translate to reality. So there is a real reason why we have to have that commander-in-chief in place who can, as they say in Making of America, he can act, a single executive can act with vigor, but he cannot evade accountability. And then we know that the legislature will be slow simply because of the logistics of how they work. That doesn't answer the around the world part, but that's all basically been entanglements that have developed over time. Like I learned today when I was looking at some of the different wars, the reason we have a heavy influence in the Philippines is because of, we declared war on Spain in 1898 because they sunk a ship that we cared about. And so we've had a 120-year presence in the Philippines ever since. And that's what's partly created such problems that drew Japan to warfare in World War II. So every time we have a reaction to something, there's going to be the unintended consequences, right? That which is seen and unseen. We're always going to have the unseen. And I think that it's been unavoidable 220 years of consequence becoming a new reaction that needed another new reaction, and here we are. Whether it's constitutional or not, I don't think the Constitution even deals with it. Nowhere does it say anything like President Washington said, that don't make entangling alliances. You know, Benjamin Franklin said in one of the things I read that we have to do everything possible to avoid war, right? And that's why we have a State Department, and that's why we have a lot of those places where we have military, is to prevent war.
Yeah, and to address what you said about, yeah, you have to have a force that's prepared and ready. And so, but I think back then they had state militias, and that was what they intended to call upon in a moment's notice. So, and he cites even Massachusetts, you know, with Shays' Rebellion, how they had to call upon that, and with their own state power. I think originally, you know, and they've cited a few times in the papers also that the distance of the United States, it's like an island, you know, and back then they didn't have airplanes. You could very easily see the enemy coming afar off, but not now. Now you could have a missile on our shores within minutes. So you have to have those fighter jets prepared. So I do think the way things are, you know, some of it's very necessary, like Juliet and I had been discussing, but we just want to see it done constitutionally. It's like, okay, that's today's modern needs, but let's not just circumvent the Constitution. Let's make it legal the way we're doing it. So it reminded me of this quote. I'll find what paper this was. Let's see. It's in Federalist 41. So this is James Madison. And he says, the distance of the United States from the powerful nations of the world gives them the same happy security. A dangerous establishment can never be necessary or plausible so long as they continue a united people. But let it never for a moment be forgotten that they are indebted for this advantage to the Union alone. The moment of its dissolution will be the date of a new order of things. So the great importance of our strength really lying in the Union, in the United States together. That's what gives us our greater protection. But I wanted to also address how this applies to us personally, because I know that for us in this country, it's kind of like we can't prevent a war. We can't prevent Congress from declaring war. That seems a little out of our control, but we can control ourselves. And this principle of union not only within like our community, but within ourselves, within our personal selves, you know, being one with yourself. There's so many people that are so conflicted in their own minds and bodies, and then their families, being united in your families, and then with your other community. I felt like that was that's something that we do have control over, and that by reading these papers we can start applying those principles to our lives. So I don't know if you guys had any thoughts on that. I know that's a little more like left field, but it's applicable. And I think our conversations often come back to, why are we where we're at right now, and what can we do about it? And it's always comes to a personal level. So did you have any thoughts on that, or any thoughts on any of these other topics? I know, Julie, you probably had something you wanted to get to as well.
I was thinking really quick that, like, along the lines of what you're saying, I mean, I totally agree. That's the first thing that came to my mind when you read that quote about the Union, is our unity as a nation. And it just makes me think that, you know, the discussion so much recently about the divisiveness that we're experiencing, and people fail to really look, we get so, like, human nature gets so wrapped up in like turning against each other and everything. And if you know, some people would argue that it's our enemies that are creating this divisiveness. And it just made me think with that, we are, and how that weakens us in so many ways, especially like in a military way, like just our, you know, we can't function as a union when we're so divided. So that importance of, and I agree, it totally starts with us, because when we think about, like, if people are, you know, creating this divisiveness over, you know, vaccines or racism and everything like that, like, that's something that we can control. Like, you know, if we are, you know, if we have unity with ourselves, if we, you know, control how we react to people and how we contribute or don't contribute to the argument or to the divisiveness in our daily lives, in our conversations and everything that we do. I mean, we do have control over that, because it's a cultural thing. It's a cultural warfare is what it is. Like, you know, Tyler named like so many other types of warfare. Well, there's also cultural warfare that I feel like we're engaged in, that our enemies are just sitting back and laughing at us.
Brooke, I know you're looking for actionable things that we can do, and unfortunately I don't have a great answer for that, but just to kind of go along with what Leah was talking about, shoot, now that I've totally lost my train of thought, but in the vein of, you know, oh, I know where I was going with that. Forgive the train of thought going into the tunnel. So as we consider our society and we consider the divisiveness that we have, I think it's important to recognize, to the point just made, where does that come from? And when we're able to sit around and have as many first world problems as we do, it allows for agitation over things that don't really exist. And I'm not mitigating the fact that, you know, we need to treat people fairly, and that there's probably things we could do differently in our societies and in our communities to make sure that everybody feels valued and important. But the issues existing on this grand scale, the way everybody wants to make them out to be, they go away if you're not sitting there enjoying first world problems. And I'll cite a couple of examples here to back that up. World War II, right? We've come out of the Great Depression, which was as much economic as it was emotional for people, because our economy was just crumbled. The view of the American dream didn't really exist at that point. We were galvanized in a cause, and it was bigger than my personal problems and suffering. Let's look at going into 2001, when we were really divided on politics. You know, we had President Clinton, who people loved and people hated, and then we got President George W. Bush that people loved or hated more. And then all of a sudden we get this sucker punch, going back to the standing armies thing, from a country that wasn't a country. Well, who do we attack? Who do we retaliate against? And what that did is that galvanized us together again, because my personal sorrows and wallows didn't matter as much because we have a common goal and an objective. And so I guess maybe this does give something that we can work on. How well do we know our communities? How well do we know what problems exist beyond what's within my own walls of my home or within the walls of my head? Are there other people that I can serve? Are there other people that I can pay attention to and I can recognize and notice as human beings, as children of God, as whatever you want to look at it as, and see, you know what, they are important. What matters to them, and how can I help them in that cause? And maybe that's where this all needs to start. Going back to your question, Brooke, of how do we reconcile things for ourselves? Well, help somebody else reconcile what's going on with them. And it's amazing how your problems seem to kind of go away.
I like that thought. What stood out to me was when you said, looking at someone else and saying, how can I help you in your cause? Really seeing people for the individuals that they are, rather than these labels that we've slapped onto people and that only cause division. No matter how good a label might be, it's divisive. But if we could just, I often think, if someone were hurt and bleeding on the side of the road, I would go to help them. I wouldn't be like, well, tell me first, are you a vaxxer or an anti-vaxxer? Tell me first, are you Democrat, Republican? I would go help that person. But should someone be like bleeding on the side of the road before we're just cordial and willing to help them in whatever they have a need of? It really shouldn't matter. And just pausing, I think, to just see people without judgment. That's a challenge. I think I can't remember what study was done, but people make a judgment of someone within, I think, 3 seconds or so. You see them, either their appearance, how they talk, what their name is, and then you try to, oh, where are you from? What do you do for a living? You immediately try to put them in these boxes and with these labels. So I think that is very much something productive that we could all work toward, is connecting with that person, on finding anything in common with them. Or even if you don't have something in common, helping them, just service. And anyway, were there any other thoughts?
Okay, so that makes me think about something. Really quick that I've probably told before, because this is something I've been talking about since, I don't know, Joey was like 5, maybe a little older. I think once I was pregnant with my 3rd boy, I realized, like, oh my gosh, I'm in trouble, because I looked around me and everyone has problems with the mother-in-laws. I'm like, I'm gonna be the mother-in-law, like on the boys' side, right? Like all the girls go to their moms, and I'm like, I'm gonna have grandkids that I'm never gonna see. I'm like, how? So like literally, like my oldest was like 6 years old probably at the most. And I started this like exercise in thinking about, I thought about like why everyone has these problems, and how no woman's ever good enough for their son, and blah blah blah, and all these different things. And so I started like looking at women and trying to see, okay, a woman who I would not want my child to marry, right? And I would think, if my child loved her, what can, like, trying to see people from a different how could I love that person? I mean, I did strange.
I think you're breaking up.
New version of people watching. How would I love them? What can I just trying to see further into them? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, that's what I get for trying to multitask. I can't cook and talk at the same time, evidently. Okay, so anyways, so I was saying that, this just became like my new like way of looking at people, specifically women, you know, and then I started like just people in general, but just it changed me and it changed how I saw everyone. So suddenly now I was like immediately trying to fight against that, like that judgment that we just do as in part of our human nature, you know. Not that I was not judgmental. I've had my share of crazy times in life and making all kinds of crazy choices. So I just look at people and think like, oh, they're this or that. But I did stereotype people, or it just made me realize like this like change that I had in myself once I purposely every day tried to see people differently and tried to think, how would I love them? If I'd meet someone or talk to them and think, if you were going to be my daughter-in-law, how would I love you? How would I get past whatever, you know, misperceptions, or how I basically tried to see everyone as good enough to marry my son, you know, tried to find that in every person. And it just like that memory just stood out to me when you were talking, like it just helps to be more humane, you know, get in touch with that humanity and to see people that way instead of casting judgments and letting ourselves get carried away with this divisiveness. You know, we can really find that. We find that in everybody when we look for it, that something that's lovable and just something that we can love in everyone, you know, and not just look into our own, letting our own issues, I guess, project on other people. Anyways, that was a little bit of a sidestep, but it just came to my mind like so strongly.
No, I don't think it's a sidestep. I think that was perfect application of, you've actually practiced this already. And I think you would probably say through practice, it becomes you. You know, you don't have to now mentally be like, okay, don't judge, do that. You naturally do that.
Right. It just became natural. Right. Yeah. It became natural, and it broke that, it broke that part of me that I was concerned about being that mother-in-law who would never be happy. I'm like, you know, it helped kind of heal that part of me of, you know, not being able to accept someone because they're not good enough or whatever. You know? So it healed a part of me, I think.
I've experienced that a little bit with my own children too, because I wanted, ever since they were young, I felt like, no, I want them to come to me for anything. And so I've really tried to nourish those relationships and to not cast judgment even on the little things like spilling the milk, to not become angry and to just say, oh, we all make mistakes, or, you know, and to really engender that. And there have been a couple times now where my kids, especially as teenagers, have come to me and they openly share a lot. And so I've been, I can't say, oh, it was because I did this, and this, but like you know, not wanting to be that mother-in-law, I was like, no, I want to be that parent. I don't want to be that parent where they're like, well, I couldn't go to my mom because she's so judgmental or angry or whatever. So I think that is, you know, another thing that we can do that's so helpful. If we could strengthen our own families in this nation, the rest of the nation would be stronger. Tiffany, do you have something?
Yeah, I just love the examples you guys gave, because it's work. It's work to think that way, and we have to proactively do it. There's a book called Habits of a Happy Brain, I think is what it's called. And it actually goes into the fact that our brains are hardwired for judgment. It's a survival thing. And in a first world problems, it's not necessarily as important. And so we take those judgments and we often misjudge people. But in that book, it talked about how that our brains are hardwired to survive. And so that judgment is actually really, really important for a healthy habits of a happy brain. I always get it wrong. Tyler just texted it to me. That's what the book is called. It's a really fabulous book about how we need the good hormones and the bad hormones, and how so often we only want the good ones. And I think this plays into this is it's work. We need to actively and consciously think about what we can do to be a little kinder. It doesn't always come natural. And if it doesn't come natural to you, that's okay. Just It is part of the hormones in our body. But like Leah's example, when we're willing to work and do it, it becomes a lot easier. And over time, it'll be more and more easier. And you'll think of more and more ways to be kind, which sounds kind of silly. I mean, that's what we're taught since we're little, right? Be kind. But that human nature goes against that sometimes. And sometimes we try and judge in a good way, because that is important. Certain judgments are required, but we also have to be careful and actively work towards just being kind.
I love the intersection of the micro and the macro here because, you know, like we've talked about before, government wouldn't be necessary if men were angels, right? And so we're not angels. And so we need to develop a system that where we can manage our own, what's within our personal purview. And if you're like me with my past, where having gone through a divorce, I remember throwing my hands up like I can't even control my immediate, you know, situation, what's going on there. We were out of harmony. I happen to have built a great co-parenting situation now. My ex-wife has even asked me to come over to give her a blessing, things like that. And her husband's great and everything like that. That's trying to take care of the micro here, because the macro will control us too, you know, and the macro is comprised of micro individuals who hopefully know how to manage their behavior, because when wartime hits, there are certain things in place where if you turn a blind eye and you have a group full of prisoners, and this happened in World War II, where, you know, we had some American soldiers upset that they just got out of a battle, they got slaughtered, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of prisoners there, and all the presiding authorities are gone, and then they wipe them out and they come back. What happened? They can just blame it on any situation, right? Because they're not governed by a moral compass there. They're allowing their emotions to get the best of them, to judge, you know, their situation, you know, because they're from across the ocean from Germany, right? And so and correct me if I'm wrong, with Roman history, it was very dangerous for generals to come into Rome. I think they were even not allowed to come into Rome because they had a whole army at their command and they could easily take over the government. So there's that component too. That's the macro. And so
the army was not the generals themselves could come in, but the army was not allowed. And generals kind of address the Senate.
Okay, good. So that's perfect. So obviously, you know, each of these generals and on down the ranks, they were all raised by moms and dads, right? Hopefully. And, you know, and hopefully those moms and dads talked about these principles that we're all talking about, where they sat them down and said, okay, don't judge. And here's why. And we all bleed the same. We're all humans. And we're all from the same family of God. And when you start to think of it that way, even if you're talking to an atheist, you can say, well, you know, what harm is it to create this energy of goodness and prayer that everybody's healthy and happy and fair and honest. When you create that environment, I don't know if you guys have ever read George Washington when he was 14 years old. Think of the significance of the age when you compare it to other forward thinkers like him. But he acquired 110 rules of civility. And I recommend you guys go through and check that out. If you're not blown away like I am, I don't know what. 14-year-old enumerated 110 rules, and it's just a small little book. I grabbed one when I was in Washington, D.C. with my son a few years back, and it's very interesting about managing what you can manage, which is yourself. How do you behave in public? How do you treat others? Are you aware? Are you self-aware enough? And gosh, I know I could think of being a single in some of the single communities that I'm in and circles that I'm in. There's some people that just seem to be completely oblivious to what's going on outside of themselves. And so this is a very relevant, I'm glad that we're talking about this. This is very relevant because we got to attack the micro before we can ever expect the macro, because the standing army was a very important thing, because yeah, we won the war and we gained independence, but guess what? 2 presidents later, or 3 presidents later, was it Madison, where the War of 1812 hit? And so we had another big issue. We better have a standing army, or guess what? The whole revolution was for naught. Or we're subjects again to the crown. So this is good discussion.
Well, and I think to kind of bring it back to the standing army again, because Derek, I feel like you kind of recapped or summed that all up really well, talking about the macro versus the micro. You know, what is it we can do in our homes and in our communities? Are we raising people that are able to see beyond themselves? Because if we had a standing army that's immoral and based on immoral concepts and principles, or a lack of respect or understanding of human decency and respect, what do you end up with? The perfect breeding ground to create tyranny, right? But if you've got a standing army of people that are moral and inherently good, then you've got a standing army that's able to do remarkable and incredible things. Then you've got a standing army that's able to fight the greatest empire, the greatest military might on the planet, and come away with freedoms that will fundamentally change the way the world operates. Right. And I think that's where it is that we need to make sure that we're seeing people as people. I just watched an incredible movie. It was written by the same author who wrote The War Horse, and I can't remember his name, but it was called Waiting for Anna. And if you haven't watched it, it's free on Amazon Prime right now. And it's this incredible and beautiful movie that's based on actual events with fictitious characters. And the premise is that it's in southern France, which was still free. They hadn't been occupied by Germany quite yet. Definitely not to the extent of northern France. And there's this woman who's trying to help smuggle Jewish people into Spain, where they'll be safe. And it's the coming of age story of this 13-year-old shepherd boy who he gets involved in it. And he learns to love these Jewish people, and he can't understand why it is the Germans hate him. Well, ironically enough, he becomes very good friends with a German general colonel, who's sent down to basically occupy his little town. And so then he's got this conflict with this general who's seemingly a very good man, just caught on the wrong side of a political battle. And these Jews that he's trying to protect. And, you know, I think that kind of shows that there needs to be a humanity in a standing army. There needs to be humanity in the society behind that standing army. And where does that start? It starts at the micro. And you get enough of those micros, and eventually you've got this beautiful macro.
That's exactly right. And there's some other beautiful examples as well. Tyler, remind us after or at the end, or get with me. I want to get that movie that I've already forgotten the title. I want to make sure that I get that. Hacksaw Ridge is another great story where there was an American soldier that refused to take up arms, and he was just going to provide medical relief. And I'm just going to leave it at that. I recommend you see how he went from having absolutely no camaraderie with his fellow soldiers because they thought he was a sellout, wasn't going to help out with the war, and he ended up having more courage and bravery than the rest of them. And then the other one was just recently shared by one of our church leaders, the Battle of Fredreicksburg, where a Confederate soldier, not with the Union, not supporting the Constitution, on the other side of the political aisle, military aisle, whatever you want to call it, could not stand the cries in the battlefield, where the second you stepped out, you were in the sniper's sights and you could be taken out. But he spent the night hearing the moans and cry for water in the battlefield, that he couldn't take it anymore, went to his commanding officer, petitioned for permission to go over there, to where he finally, his commanding officer, the general, said, you're going to be killed instantly, the instant you go out into the field. And the rest of the story is, of course, he goes over the wall, and just before he's shot, he's easily identified as helping Union soldiers as well as Confederate soldiers. He had gone to his buddies and got everybody's canteens that he could get and put them over his shoulder and went and started giving people water in the battlefield and helping them out. That's the micro within the macro. So here's an individual in a larger body of military men whose name is proverbial to this day. In the Battle of Fredreicksburg, I think it's called the Miracles, the Angel Saint, I can't think of the name, Mary Heights, I think it is. And so that's another awe-inspiring, where all of the men who would have taken out anybody in that battlefield saw that this man was providing relief, and everybody laid down their arms while he gave aid, rendered aid to even his enemies.
You know, I like the quote about the greatest battles of life are fought within the secret chambers of the soul. And when I think of micro or internal, I think of even our own bodies and the current issues with health, because we're always the fight or flight response. We're now triggering that almost continuously. And the impact that it has on our body from continuously being ready to fight, you know. So I think of that standing army as it applies to my own body, my own soul. Am I looking always to defend myself, my ego? And I find when I have that, then I am always got a level of anxiety that's always going. And it turns up in ulcers and cancer and all these impacts. And so I think from a personal standpoint, there's a lot of things to say about, am I always ready to fight? Or do I need that in right places? Or should my default be quite an open and peaceful being? And so I love these comments. And so when I take that to myself, that's kind of the impression that I've had of how to bring this to me.
Thank you. This has been such a well-rounded, beautiful discussion, from the macro to the micro and everywhere in between. And I appreciate all these suggestions. So I'd like to close it by just challenging us and anyone listening to really ponder what it is that you can do to gain some more union within your own self, your own family, your community, whatever that is, whether it's on a physical bodily level like David was talking about, or mental, emotional, or those are so, I bet we would find some great inspiration in all of these books and films that we suggested too. So I'll put those in the notes for our discussion. And we will see you next week. Thanks everyone for participating.